drop down in temperature. But today we're at the 20th of May. If you go and look at some previous videos I had done, you'll notice that I had talked about something that might come in around the 19th or 20th, an emotional spike kind of thing. This was in the data sets from the Alta reports years ago, not specifically for this particular month or anything, but a descriptor set that the most recent time I've run for emotional intensity values, I thought I saw a few indicators that that older forecast was going to happen around the 19th of this month. And so I'd mentioned this in a few videos saying, hey, something might come in around on the 19th of the month that will provide us this emotional jump off or levering or propelling into desperation language. And that, you know, just heads up, right? And then we arrive at this point in time, we get the FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, being spewed out of a giant FUD hose all over the crypto markets. And it was deliberate, it was done for someone's plan, someone's agenda. We can speculate that somebody acquired cryptos in the process, flushing out the weak hands, attempting to alter the balance of power, so to speak, within the ownership of cryptos. And so we arrive at the 19th and we get the precipitous plunge down. Now that happened to coincide with the old forecast from the Soaring 20s report, which was December of 2017, maybe. I have to look again. But anyway, we'd had 64,000 as a strike point, at which time we would have a drop that would exceed 30%. Now, I wrote it as 30+% because I didn't want to tell people that it was likely to be a 50% drop. So if you go back and you read those old reports, it'll say 30+%. And factually, at the time that I came across that data, it's like, you know, I know that the net result on this is going to be precipitous and it will be greater than 30%, but will it reach 50% and will it be 50% of the all-time high or 50% of the most recent high, or, you know, how do you judge that, right? So 30% was a good indicator because it was all about a visceral response, because the data sets had described it as a point at which many people would start literally feeling like they were going to vomit. And so in that sense, it was a little tiny mini echo of the kind of emotional reaction and physical flushing that people encountered in the 1929 crash. So this is what I'm saying, right? That, okay, so time is tricky shit, right? Pay attention. So we've all been bombarded with FUD. But that FUD was forecast in started being forecast in 2014 or so, and was culminating in a set that as I think of it, as matured in 2017 and was reported in December of that year within the Alta reports, okay? That's when this little forecast was written up. And so here's the problem on all of this in terms of in discussing the woo of it all. So this is FUD woo or woo FUD, all right? It's actually FUD against woo is what's coming out now. That's what we've just experienced, was a giant manipulation. Elon Musk's shit postings, his shit tweets, everybody else who was in there, all the big players, all of that verbiage was aimed at one goal, which was to get all of the weak hands to dishoard, to unhodl. And it had been forecast in 2017 from a set that had been really, this was the maturation process. So just briefly, we would get a set of data that would grow like this over time and would be complete or mature at this point here when it was put into the report, but it would have linguistic threads that would go all the way back to its inception point. And so each and every one of these sets would be each and every one of these circles would represent a period of data gathering in which more and more data glommed into that same set around that same meme, if you will, or theme, and that thematically it grew over time until it emerged in this forecast. That's conceptually something that we're looking at here. All right, so this, though, was that data set there referenced the emotional ties back to 1929. At that time, it wasn't reported, but it was in the data, and because of the nature of what we were going through in 2017, plus the fact that I was also basically dying of cancer, undiagnosed, didn't know what it was, etc., it could only work a brief period of time every day on these things. I was just simply not able to keep up with it. So I wasn't able to be voluminous and put in 30,000 words if I could get away with 3,000 words. Physically did not have the capability. Anyway, though, so the data sets then were pointing at 1929 as a specific inception point, very much like the data itself, as a specific inception point for the echo that we're living through in this time. So the concept that was attempting to be, that I derived out of that data was that the 1929 crash, which we think of as happening just in 1929, but it was actually a series of crashes. And they started in 1929, but they went all the way through until 1933 when the bond market crashed. What we're going to go through is a rhyming echo of that, not a retrace, not a repeat in any way, but the emotional outpouring, the emotional responses to the conditions in 1929 through 1933 will be echoed now. So this is from 1929 to 1933. And there's a whole lot of stuff in here, by the way, that also needs to be brought up relative to Judaism, to Jewish people, to specific contracts, and those sorts of things. Because those also are going to be echoing over this next period of time, which that forecast was for our time now, 2021 through 2025. And it'll actually happen, most of it will happen in 2021 through 2024, but there will still be a little trailing bit in 2025. That's why it's written out that way. But it'll be a rhyming echo to the emotional trauma that everybody went through then. Only now we're going through that same emotional trauma, curiously, probably caused by the same group of people. And this time the response is going to be different. So in 2025, the outcome will be remarkably different than the setup than 1933 left for the rest of that decade. And there's so many layers of the temporal aspects of it that I'm just not going to get into, okay? But I know that the data sets at the time, in 2014 through 2014, Bitcoin was just nascent, right? Hardly even being mined. So the FUD aspects of it and the specifics about 64,000 had not arrived in 2014. They had arrived by 2017, so that we had a much more fleshed out view of the reality in which this data set is maturing. And so we end up with this forecast here of, at the time, the forecast was basically, as we got up to 64,000 on one side or the other, 64,000 per Bitcoin, we would have a crash that might take us down all the way down to 50% of some major high. So maybe it was going to be 50% of that 64,000, right? Which would result in us going down to 30,000. But we actually hit a low of 29,000. So it was about half of some major high. Probably we went up to 64,000 and then hovered in the upper 50s or something for some time. I don't pay attention to prices, so I don't know, but probably hovered up in the upper 50s, and it was 50% of that value. We go down to it, and then we rise back up. Now, what I did do was to go on out and check the actual transaction volumes on the blockchains, on Bitcoin and Ethereum and all the other, just Bitcoin and Ethereum and Bitcoin, it's a SV but one of the other alt Bitcoins. I just went and looked at the blockchain transaction volumes during this period of time to see if we had a setup that would actually show the volume on as basically on the premise is that if we're going to have a precipitous drop, you will see the same kind of activity on the blockchain of the coins changing hands as you do on the way up. And we didn't. So I knew right off that any price stuff was all basically within the exchanges. It did not translate over to the blockchains themselves. So it did match the fear, uncertainty, and doubt stuff that came out of that data set, culminated in 2017. And thus I was pretty sanguine about the price drop, didn't care much. As I say, I don't follow the prices anyway, right? So, but it didn't worry me because I knew as part of that data set from way back when in 2017 that there were some very interesting aspects about this particular time. And so if we had the temporal marker right here show up, and aha, we did, so we had a TM here in this set, and it showed up, it manifested, right? Okay, so good, because maybe, and by the way, this is a truism within the work I had done, that once you start getting major temporal markers show up, the odds favor the next temporal marker also showing up. In other words, the sets are cohesive. They appeared to be cohesive in their prescient value throughout the range of material within that set. And so if one of the temporal markers shows up, then it increases the odds of the others showing up. And as each and every one of those do show up, you get into a situation, got to reset and stuff, where you get up to a point where you feel, as an outside observer of this, that there's a certain level of certainty to these, to the remaining temporal markers also showing up. And so here are some of the other temporal markers, right? 100,000 parties. And that's a temporal marker that was associated, and it is in that set. And that was going to happen in the same year that this event happened. And in that same year, this event was going to happen before the coming December. So in other words, before Christmas. So in the data sets, back in 2017, it was discussed in such a way that one got the impression that there would be $100,000 Bitcoin parties around Christmas time, around holiday times, right? Such that people were in a much more happy mood. They were very ebullient. They were, open the champagne, and get out the oysters, that kind of thing, right? And la la la, seasonal thing. Now there's a lot going on in this thing. It's a wonderful life kind of a picture, or sort of it is, because even in that film, It's a Wonderful Life, there's a background of the Depression of the 1930s, and it's the realization of the human values within that depression that made that movie have its redeeming qualities, right? It presented you with redeeming qualities to the depression itself. Now, this was what the report was doing, was presenting me the redeeming qualities to the conditions that would otherwise seem somewhat depressing. And as you know, I'm not depressed. I'm a little beat up because I was in the car for too many hours yesterday, and my old bones I'd rolled too much in my life and fought too hard, and so my bones, they don't like being crammed in and held steady in that position for too long. But in any event, but no, I'm not depressed. I'm just achy. But anyway, so we have $100,000 Bitcoin parties to look forward to, and presumably, if this data set will mature at the same rate as all the other temporal markers, its accuracy rate should be pretty good, and it should show up sometime before December. And there's a lot going on within this data set. It was a very prescient data set. It had within it some spectacular hits like the Blondes on Boats, the Costa Concordia's sinking and all of that. There were many, many, many other temporal markers in this larger set, right? And so I have I'm fairly content that the other things will occur, that we'll get this $100,000 parties. Now, that's not the end of Bitcoin, right? It doesn't stop at 100,000. But within the data sets, we got to the point where we were celebrating the 100,000 Bitcoin. At the same time, sad that the dollar was so shitty, but at the same time, there was hope that because of this other stuff that was developing, but I'll get back to that in a minute. But within it all, at the same time, almost instantly after the $100,000 Bitcoin parties, we get to this point where Bitcoin becomes unobtainium, all right? So at that point, yeah, you can buy a few Satoshis, but the people that have the Bitcoin are basically thereafter able to name their own price if they decide to sell. And so it becomes something that ultimately becomes worked up to the level of settling sovereign debt over time. And at this point, as we transition in this period of 2021 through 2025, as we get in here, the Bitcoin will go to the point where you just don't see it transaction. There won't be a lot of activity on public exchanges for whole Bitcoins or large quantities of Bitcoins and so on. Satoshis will rise in value and will represent their own basic level of cryptocurrency where, you work to buy a whole Satoshi, that kind of a thing, right? Or your first Satoshi. Anyway, though, so the Bitcoin's going to continue on up. It is it had long lifespan within the data sets in the prescient component. And presumably at this stage, the data sets have, and my interpretation of it, have proven of value. I mean, some people have made themselves millionaires from reading my shit and following it. And so I have a good anticipation. I have a good anticipation that over these next few years, the rest of this data set's going to mature. And so the rest of that data set contains stuff like a terrible winter coming up, a revolution in Europe, revolution in the United States, and all different kinds of bizarrenesses. But all of the language in here has to be understood within the context that's going to be occurring. All right, so in the background of all of the stuff that's going to be going on with the financial system and all of the FUD that they're heaping out, trying to control it. And the point of the FUD was for someone to gather Bitcoins and to drive out all of the weak hands. And then basically what they're trying to do is to move the herd around by spewing out FUD from various different angles onto the populace, onto humanity. Now, in the background of all of this FUD spewing over 2021, we have piling up in here. So I'm going to remove this here. Yeah, okay, so within this data set that basically matured in this process here, and it begun way back in like 2003, and its main point of maturation was in those years, we have things like the revival, all right? And I'll just put it that way, revival. And we'll get into that in a second. We also have the winter, and we have the EU, and I'll put it down here as Vikings. And we have tons more stuff that was within this data set that we are able to track because of specific temporal markers that we can see emerge, prices, right? So it's not ambiguous. We didn't go up to 75,000 and fall down. And we didn't go up to 60,000 as the all-time high and fall down. We went up to somewhere around 64,000 as an all-time high and then fell down. So we have that as a temporal marker that has a numeric value. That's why I tried to get as many numeric values teased out of the data sets as I possibly could as we went forward. And most of them failed, right? Because the data sets were just so riddled with numbers that part of the processing that I did in order to extract the prescient language was to just throw away numbers like mad. because they're all, like, the internet is composed of numbers, right? That's a basic substrate. So you can't really, you can't take it at face value when you encounter it in this kind of weird-ass woo process. And so all the numbers had to be thrown out. But whenever I did get some, I would always put them into the reports because they were good for this particular thing. Just like wherever I could, I tried to label an image, right? Something that would stand out, that could not be denied later on and could be used as a clue into a particular, as a pointer, so to speak, into a particular point of reality. Blondes on boats, right? And in the data sets, it describes a situation where a blonde woman was taken to where she should not go. And aha, that's what occurred with Costa Concordia. It came out in the very first article. So it was linguistically a really good pointer to put blondes on boats as the title for that. Just as we you know, the 64K, $64,000 question. And so there we go, right? At the time that was written, back in 2017, I think we'd hit 2,000 or 20,000 on Bitcoin at that point. But probably that number was emerging way back, maybe 2016, maybe even 2015, back in the stage when it was totally unbelievable. Probably at 2015, maybe we were in, you know, double digits for Bitcoin. I don't follow prices that well, so I don't have a real good memory of what time what number appeared. I have to go look that shit up, and I'm lazy. Anyway, so within that set here, we also had $600 gold or silver, $600 silver, and other stuff relative to gold that I'm not going to go into now because it deserves its own separate video. But in any event, the silver was also in that set. We also had within this set right here for temporal markers, we had this Antarctica. We had the UFOs and others, right? So here we are, right? We've got the UFO sets that were predicted, the secrets revealed coming out. We have, you know, being disgorged from deep in the government, in a background of rioting in the streets in the United States, rioting in Europe, in the background of the sun disease, you know, so the sun disease. And it was confusing because the sun itself, the big scary ball in the sky, can be thought of as being diseased because we're in the grand solar minimum, where we have very little sunspots, so it's behaving abnormally. All of these sets were in that same set as this here, which still has these out there and many other predictions as forecast yet, right? Because they're not really predictions, they're forecasts that the language would appear. Whether or not the language actually accurately describes the events, we couldn't know at this point. All we could really forecast was that the language would appear. And so arguably, a lot of people are talking about $600,000, $800,000, $900,000 silver. So arguably, we hit that mark. Whether or not we ever actually get transactionally that level of value. However, transactionally, we did hit that mark, and you can plainly see if you go and look on Twitter and these kind of places, you know, a copy of that being written and published publicly in that year. Anyway, so revival Antarctica, and so the Antarctica stuff is connected to the UFOs obliquely, but also is focused on what I chose to call real human history. And real human history was part of the counterpoint to the FUD, to the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that the powers that be are spewing out over us with all of their diseases and all of their other bullshit, right? Still trying to maintain control as all of the masses wake up. And